Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to explore one of the most consequential and honestly fiercely debated topics in international relations right now, and that is India's true status in global politics. Now, this is a subject of massive consequence, both theoretically and practically. We constantly hear India described in all sorts of ways, right? A rising superpower, a civilizational state, a crucial democratic counterweight. But if we strip away the headlines, where does India actually stand? Is it a great power today, or is it something else entirely? To answer this, we're going to systematically unpack a really brilliant, albeit dense, academic framework laid out by scholar Brendan Sims. We're going to look directly at the data, the historical arc, and the raw, sometimes uncomfortable geopolitical realities. We want to understand what India truly is right now, what specific constraints are holding it back, and ultimately what it absolutely must do to complete its strategic rise. Okay, let's dive right into this. So, here is our intellectual roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with a great power debate, introduce Sims' 4Rs framework, and then apply that to see why India is considered an almost power. From there, we'll dissect something called the conversion capacity gap, take a hard look at the China benchmark, and finally, lay out the actual path to greatness. Section 1. The Great Power Debate. Let's begin by defining the very foundation of our entire analysis today. Fundamentally, we have to rethink what we actually consider power. You see, a great power isn't just a country with a massive population, a booming GDP, or even a nuclear arsenal. Those are just raw assets. In international relations theory, a great power is a political unit that has the sovereign capacity to actually shape global rules. Sims defines them brilliantly as the orderers rather than the ordered, meaning they don't just sit back and adapt to an international system created by somebody else, they actively determine the regional or global order. This distinction is absolutely crucial because it separates countries that are simply large or wealthy from the ones that actually wield systemic global authority. To really understand India today, we have to look at how its strategic identity has evolved over time. Back in 1947, under Jawaharlal Nehru, India pursued non-alignment and what we'd call moral leadership. But then came 1962. The defeat by China exposed a really harsh reality. Moral authority without material and military preparedness just cannot sustain global standing. The world operates on material power. So by 1971, under Indira Gandhi, we see a massive shift toward regional realism, which culminated in the creation of Bangladesh. Then in 1991, India opened its economy, realizing that wealth is a strict prerequisite for security. And fast forward to 1998, the nuclear tests firmly asserted India's strategic autonomy. Step by step, India learned that to be taken seriously on the world stage, it had to combine its civilizational prestige with hard, coercive capabilities. Let's move into Section 2 and look at how this builds into Brendan Sims' specific criteria for evaluating global dominance. Sims evaluates states using what he calls the 4Rs framework. That's resources, reach, reputation, and resilience. Let's break that down. Resources include your economy, your military assets, and your technology. Reach is your ability to project influence far from home. Think deepwater naval power and global alliances. Reputation is simply whether you are actually recognized as an equal by other major powers. And resilience, that's your internal social cohesion and your ability to absorb shocks. Now, the crucial thing to remember here is that these four attributes heavily interact. A glaring weakness in one dimension, like a lack of global military reach, can entirely nullify massive strengths in another dimension, like having a vast population and abundant resources. It's like a giant puzzle where you really need all the pieces to fit. When we apply those 4Rs, it gives us Sims' highly debated hierarchy of contemporary powers. At the very top, you have the US, China, Russia, and the UK as clear great powers. Why? Because they possess unique combinations of independent nuclear reach and institutional vetoes. France sits right there on the borderline. But interestingly, India is categorized alongside Japan, Germany, and the EU as an almost great power. Now, impartially speaking, this isn't a dismissal of India's immense size. Rather, Sims is arguing that despite its massive resources, India suffers from incomplete strategic conversion. It just lacks the sustained, autonomous capability to project force or shape order globally compared to those countries in the top tier. And this brings us perfectly to Section 3. We are now going to apply this academic framework directly to India's current geopolitical reality. When we look at India specifically through the lens of the 4Rs, a really clear picture of an incomplete rise starts to emerge. Under resources, yes, India has a vast top 5 economy, but it suffers from a heavy reliance on imported defense equipment. Under reach, it has absolute dominance over the subcontinent for sure, but limited naval mass to actually control the wider oceans. As for reputation, India enjoys immense civilizational prestige and democratic standing, but it faces pure denial, specifically from China, which flat out refuses to treat it as an equal. And finally, resilience. India has exceptional historical durability, having survived wars and partition, but internal polarization and inequality threaten its social cohesion. So you see, India possesses enormous raw ingredients of greatness, but it struggles to project sustained global military or institutional reach. This brings us to a highly provocative warning from Brendan Sims. He points out the very real danger of what he calls peak India. He suggests there is a risk of a stalling of India's demographic window before its strategic completion. So what does this all mean? Well, we have to ask ourselves, what happens if India's population ages before it remedies its glaring weaknesses in human capital, state capacity, and domestic manufacturing? If that demographic dividend expires before India translates its massive workforce into deep industrial strength, it could permanently settle on a plateau. It would be pivotal, sure. It would be courted by everyone, absolutely. But ultimately, it would remain an incomplete power, unable to truly shape the international order. So why is this stalling such a massive risk? We uncover the answer in Section 4, the conversion capacity gap. This is the critical vulnerability. To truly understand India's constraints, we need to wrap our heads around this academic concept of conversion capacity. I know it sounds like dense academic jargon, but it simply means the ability of a political and administrative system to efficiently translate raw resources into usable state power and strategic effect. Think of it this way. Having a massive GDP or a billion citizens is basically useless in a fast-moving geopolitical crisis if you lack the bureaucratic machinery, the indigenous defense industrial base, and the administrative competence to actually mobilize them. Conversion capacity is the engine that turns potential energy into kinetic, usable power. The situation presents a really stark contrast. On one hand, India possesses massive raw resources, a vast youthful population, a top 5 global GDP, and a highly robust nuclear arsenal. Yet, on the other hand, it faces severely constrained reach. India still depends heavily on imported defense platforms, it maintains a surprisingly modest diplomatic corps for a country of its massive size, and it has limited overseas military logistics. So India's fundamental problem is not a scarcity of assets. Not at all. It is a structural mismatch in administrative execution. The resources are absolutely there, but the domestic machinery required to convert those resources into sustained global influence is still lagging behind. To manage this very real gap in hard power, India employs a brilliant diplomatic strategy known as multi-alignment. Now, let's be clear here. India's famous strategic autonomy is not the passive non-alignment of the Cold War era, not anymore. It is a highly complex, incredibly active multi-alignment. The formula goes something like this. Engage America to balance pressure. Manage China to avoid direct escalation. Cultivate Europe for advanced technology. And reassure Russia to maintain vital defense supplies. It's a strategy designed to maximize options and extract technology and leverage in a very asymmetrical, multipolar world. Let's ground this theory in some reality. What does this multi-alignment actually look like in practice? Well, it looks like India actively participating in the US-led Quad, while simultaneously holding membership in the China and Russia-heavy BRICS. It looks like purchasing discounted Russian oil to fuel its booming economy, while literally at the same time conducting advanced naval drills with the US Navy. India brilliantly plays rival camps against each other to avoid being excluded from any global decisions. However, Sims warns that there is a real danger here. If India isn't careful, this multi-alignment can simply become dependence disguised as diversification. Genuine autonomy requires indigenous capability, right? Not just expertly juggling foreign partners. This leads us right into Section 5, the China benchmark. This is without a doubt the most urgent geopolitical challenge for India. Impartially analyzing the data, India's status cannot be assessed merely against its own past. China is the relevant benchmark here. And the reality is a widening material gap. China holds massive material advantages over India in industrial scale, indigenous defense manufacturing, naval tonnage, artificial intelligence development, and overseas connectivity, particularly right in India's own backyard of South Asia. China has effectively and ruthlessly converted its economic growth into hard, coercive capability. Because great power status is relational, this widening gap is exactly why Beijing currently denies India equal status on the global stage. And this brings us to the ultimate consequence of that conversion gap we talked about. This central contradiction of Indian foreign policy is basically this. India seeks autonomous polarity as an independent great power, but it cannot balance its principal rival, China, independently. Because of the shortfall in its own conversion capacity and indigenous defense base, India is essentially forced to rely on Western coalitions, Western intelligence, and Western technology to secure its own maritime and continental borders. The harsh truth is you cannot be a fully independent order maker if you rely on outside powers to balance your immediate neighbor. So how does India actually fix this? We move to our final section, Section 6, the path to greatness, to look at the academic prescription. Brendan Sims argues that India's route to Greek power status must follow a very deliberate, strict sequence. You absolutely cannot jump to the end. The 5 steps are 1. Human foundations. 2. State conversion capacity. 3. Military capability. 4. Global reach. And finally, 5. Order shaping. The overarching argument here is that durable international status must follow internal capability, not the other way around. You simply cannot build a global empire of influence on a fractured domestic foundation. Let's look closely at step 1 because it is by far the most vital. Human foundations. Before building aircraft carriers or demanding UN Security Council seats, a great power must eradicate learning and nutritional deficits within its own borders. True statecraft starts at home. If you have a massive population, but they suffer from weak public health and lack technical education and formal employment, that population is not a strategic asset. Actually, it can become a liability. Without a healthy, educated, and cohesive society, any military expansion is simply a hollow shell. This is a foundational lesson for literally any rising power, not just India. Once that domestic foundation and industrial base are secured, we look at step 4, the Indian Ocean. Sims points out that India doesn't necessarily need immediate worldwide military parity with the US or China. But what is absolutely non-negotiable is establishing credible dominance over its own economic lifelines in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean is the critical maritime bridge. It is here that regional predominance actually translates into global reach. By securing the maritime commons, undersea infrastructure, and the vital choke points here, India proves it can provide public goods and deter adversaries outside its immediate land borders. Which brings us to the ultimate question we must leave you with today. We've seen the academic framework, the historical arc, the massive raw resources, and the glaring conversion gaps. So the question is, will India successfully execute this monumental internal transformation and cross the threshold to become a true global order maker? Or will that demographic window close, leaving it permanently stalled as a highly pivotal, deeply courted, but ultimately incomplete order taker? The stakes for the 21st century literally could not be higher. Thank you for joining us on this explainer, and keep exploring the fascinating depths of global power dynamics.